She picked it up with two fingers, the way you'd handle something you found in a dumpster, and then she let it fall. The sound it made on my kitchen tile wasn't loud, a short, dry crack, but it filled every corner of the room. I stood there looking at the pieces on the floor, white porcelain scattered across the grout like broken teeth, and I heard her laugh before I even looked up. "It was ugly anyway," she said, and turned back toward the refrigerator as if she had simply set down an empty cup. That night, after she went to bed, I called my lawyer, not to complain, not to vent. I called to make an appointment to rewrite my will from the first word to the last. There is a particular kind of lesson that takes a lifetime to fully understand, and it is this: when someone shows you exactly who they are, not in anger, not by accident, but in the casual, unhurried certainty of a person who believes they will face no consequence. The most powerful thing you can do is believe them. I had spent years interpreting generosity as its own reward. I had told myself that patience was a virtue, that family required sacrifice, that love meant absorbing things that hurt. I was wrong. Love does not require you to swallow your own grief and call it kindness. The moment that vase hit the floor, I finally understood the difference between giving from a place of genuine warmth and giving from a place of fear. Fear of conflict, fear of being called difficult, fear of a silence that might stretch on for too long. I was 64 years old, and I was done being afraid of that silence. My name is Margaret Elaine Vase. I am 64 years old, widowed going on 6 years now, and the owner, outright no mortgage, every last cent paid, of the house where I have lived for 31 years. I'd spent the better part of that Tuesday morning simply existing in my own home, which is something I had only recently learned to do without guilt. And by the time that Tuesday evening was over, I had set into motion a chain of decisions that would change my family's future in ways none of them had anticipated, least of all me. If you have ever been the person in your family who everyone leans on until leaning becomes a right, if you have ever stood in the wreckage of something irreplaceable and been told not to make it a big deal, I want you to stay with me through this entire story. Because what I did next is not something I'm ashamed of, and it is not something I did out of spite. I did it out of clarity. If that sounds like something you understand, something you wish you had understood sooner, I hope you'll let me know in the comments below. And if this is the first time you found my channel, welcome. I think you might want to subscribe before we're finished here. The house is a craftsman bungalow in a quiet part of town, the kind of neighborhood where neighbors still wave from their driveways and the oak trees are old enough to make shade worth sitting in. My husband Gerald and I bought it when our son Daniel was 4 years old, when the yard was still wild and the kitchen needed new everything. We spent decades growing into it, painting the porch, replacing the furnace, tiling the bathroom ourselves over one very long holiday weekend that ended in laughter and 2 sore backs, and a marriage that felt, in that moment, indestructible. When Gerald died of a cardiac event on a Wednesday afternoon in early spring, he was sitting in the garden chair he always sat in, and the paramedics told me later that it had been fast. I chose to believe that was a mercy. In the years that followed, I rebuilt my days carefully, the way you rebuild anything after a structural failure, slowly, with attention to what will actually hold. I retired from my position as an administrative director at the regional hospital. I planted a kitchen garden. I began walking 3 miles every morning before the town woke up, just for the pleasure of hearing my own footsteps on the pavement. I joined a book group that met on the second Thursday of every month and argued pleasantly about things that mattered very little and somehow meant a great deal. My life was not loud. It was mine. That distinction had become the most important thing I owned. I was sitting on the back porch that Tuesday morning with my second cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching the tomatoes on the vine, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't need to look. I recognized the engine, a leased SUV that my son Daniel kept cleaner on the outside than he kept his finances. And I felt the quiet of the morning close like a door. Not with dread, exactly. More like the specific awareness you get when you know what is coming and you've decided this time not to pretend otherwise. I heard the side gate open and footsteps on the flagstone path, and then my daughter-in-law Renata appeared at the corner of the house, carrying a tote bag large enough to suggest she was not planning a short visit. The relationship between Renata and me had always operated on a frequency of polite tolerance, audible only to the two of us, invisible to everyone else. Daniel believed, or chose to believe, that his wife and his mother got along fine. What actually existed was a détente, a series of unspoken agreements about what would not be said, what would not be questioned, what would be offered and accepted without discussion. Renata was 37, sharp, well-dressed, and completely convinced that my goodwill was a renewable resource that cost nothing to extract. She had married Daniel 11 years ago in a ceremony I helped pay for, and spent the reception treating me as a pleasant but minor character in her story. I had told myself that was simply how young women were with their mothers-in-law. I had been generous with that interpretation for far too long. The pattern, if I am honest about it, did not begin with Renata. It began with me, with a specific moment, roughly 8 years before that Tuesday morning, when Daniel and Renata were newlyweds and struggling with rent, and I had offered, just once, to let them stay in my guest room for a month while they sorted out their lease situation. 1 month became 3. 3 months ended with them in an apartment I helped furnish from my own savings, at my own initiative, because I had seen how thin their budget was, and I had not wanted my son to feel the weight of that. I had done it freely. I had done it gladly. And I had not understood then that what I was doing was not just helping them. I was teaching them what I was for. After they moved into that apartment, the pattern settled into something quieter, but just as consistent. Holiday dinners at my house. Not because anyone invited themselves, but because it was simply assumed, and I never corrected the assumption. Loan requests that were phrased as conversations and never repaid and never referred to again by either side until they had faded into a kind of financial amnesia, babysitting for their daughter Celia, whom I loved genuinely and without reservation, and who was the one person in this entire story who never asked anything of me that wasn't innocent, arranged around their schedule without consideration of mine. The use of my car when Renata's was in the shop, which happened twice one winter and was never mentioned again until the keys were simply expected. I gave each time. I gave because it was easier than the alternative, because I told myself it was love, because I had confused love with accommodation so thoroughly that I no longer knew where one ended and the other began. What changed was not a single event, but a convergence. Gerald's life insurance settlement, which I had set aside and not touched for 4 years out of a grief I couldn't quite name, finally resolved into a clarity. This money was mine, and I intended to use it. I had finished paying off the last small balance on the house the previous spring. I was fully retired. I had no employer, no mortgage, no financial dependence on anyone. I was, for the first time in my adult life, structurally free. And something about that freedom, real, legal, complete, made me aware of the ways I had been volunteering for a kind of bondage that nobody had forced on me. I had simply stepped into it, year after year, out of habit and love and a deeply conditioned reflex to smooth every surface I walked across. That awareness was still relatively new, tender, like a muscle that had been unused and was only beginning to remember what it could do. When Renata arrived that Tuesday morning unannounced, she did not knock. She never knocked. She came through the side gate and appeared on the porch and said, "I'm going to use your kitchen for a few hours. I need to prep for a dinner party and my oven is running too hot." Not a question, not a request. A statement, delivered with the ease of someone announcing they were going to sit in their own living room. I looked at her over my coffee cup and I said, "Good morning, Renata." She said, "Morning." Already pulling open the back door, already inside. I followed her into the kitchen. I watched her set her tote bag on the counter without asking. I watched her open my refrigerator and look inside it with the proprietorial squint of someone checking their own inventory. She moved a container of my soup to the side to make room for items she had brought. She opened 2 of my cabinets to locate the things she needed, not finding them in the first cabinet, then the second, then sighing faintly at the inconvenience. All of this happened within 4 minutes of her arrival and without a single word spoken by either of us except the greetings we had already exchanged. Then she reached for the windowsill above the sink. I kept several things on that windowsill. A small clay pot of herbs, a worn wooden recipe box that had belonged to Gerald's mother, and the vase, white porcelain, perhaps 5 inches tall, hand-painted with a thin band of blue flowers around its base. My mother had given it to me when I was 22 years old, on the day I moved into my first apartment. She had carried it wrapped in a kitchen towel and pressed it into my hands and said, "Every home needs something beautiful that doesn't have a purpose." She died of a stroke 11 years later, when Daniel was still small, and I had moved that vase to every home I'd lived in since. It had sat on every kitchen windowsill I had ever owned. Renata picked it up to move it out of her way. I saw it happen. Saw the two-finger grip, the slight elevation of her arm, and then the release. Whether it was carelessness or distraction or simply a failure to close her hand fully, I cannot say. What I can say is that she let it go before she had set it down, and it fell the short distance to the tile, and when the pieces lay there, she looked at them briefly, then she looked at me and she laughed, a short, airy exhale of a laugh, and said, "It was ugly anyway. I'll get you something nicer." I did not speak. I looked at the pieces on the floor. I felt something move through me that was not rage. Rage is hot and it rises and it passes. What I felt was cold, and it settled and it stayed. It was the sensation of a very long argument ending. I bent down and picked up each piece carefully because my mother's hands had touched that porcelain, and I was not going to leave it on the floor. I wrapped the pieces in a dish towel and set them on the counter beside the sink. Then I turned to Renata and said, in a voice that surprised me with its evenness, "I'm going to need you to pack up your things and go, Renata. Not in an hour, now." She blinked. "Margaret, it was an accident." "I heard you," I said. "Now, please." She looked at me for a moment, measuring, I think, whether this was real. And then she began, slowly, to replace the items she had set out. She did not apologize. She gathered her tote bag and she walked back through the house, and I heard the front door close behind her with a firmness that I chose to read as the punctuation mark of something finally finished. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after she left. The dish towel was on the counter. The herb pot was still on the windowsill, undisturbed. The refrigerator hummed. I want to say I felt grief, and I did, for the vase, for my mother, for the version of myself who had been so careful to be accommodating that she had never once stopped to ask what it was costing her. But underneath the grief, there was something else. Something oriented and still and almost calm. I had paid attention, finally, to the whole picture. Not just the broken thing in front of me, but the years of smaller breakages I had swept up and said nothing about. I went to my desk and found my lawyer's card. What I want to name here, because I think it is important, and because I have spent considerable time understanding it since, is the specific mechanism by which a generous person becomes a resource. It doesn't happen through malice, or not usually. It happens through repetition and the gradual reclassification of choice as category. Each time I cooked the holiday meal without being asked, it stopped being something I'd chosen and became something I did, a function, not a decision. Each time I offered money without conditions, the next conversation about money began not from the baseline of "this is your problem to solve," but from "Margaret will handle this." The psychologists who study this pattern call it something like entitlement by accretion, the process by which a person who is treated well enough and consistently enough begins to experience that treatment, not as a gift but as a right, and its withdrawal not as a reasonable limit but as an injury done to them. I had not understood this when I was inside it. I understood it completely now that I was standing outside it, looking at the shape it had made of the last decade. And here is something I would like to say plainly, for anyone who has ever felt guilty about asserting a boundary in their own home. The law is not ambiguous on this point. My house, its contents, its rooms, the food in its refrigerator, the china on its shelves, belongs to me in the complete, unqualified sense of the word. Not to my son, not to his wife, not to anyone who considers themselves a frequent visitor. I decide who enters, when, under what conditions, and on whose terms. There is no convention, no expectation, no frequency of prior visits that transfers even a fraction of that ownership to another person. I had never been told this as plainly as I'm saying it now. I think many women in my position have never been told it at all. A home is not a community resource. Generosity, offered freely, is still not a contract. Anytime I choose to close a door, that choice is legally mine and morally uncomplicated, regardless of how long I left it open before. That night, I called my lawyer, a composed woman named Sandra Greer, who had helped me manage Gerald's estate and who had, more than once, spoken to me with a directness I appreciated. I told her I wanted to come in at her earliest availability. I told her I wanted to review and revise my will, specifically the sections naming beneficiaries and the conditions under which assets would transfer. She said she had a Thursday morning slot. I took it. In the 2 days between that phone call and the appointment, I moved through my house with a particular kind of attention, the way you move through a space when you are seeing it clearly for the first time in a long while. I noticed things. The guest room where Renata had, over the course of 3 separate visits in the past year, accumulated what I could only describe as a secondary wardrobe. Cardigans on the chair, a cosmetics bag left on the bathroom shelf, 2 pairs of shoes pushed under the bed. I noticed the cabinet in the mudroom where I kept household supplies, now supplemented by items I'd never purchased and had never agreed to store. I noticed that the key to my house, which I'd given Daniel for emergencies, existed in no fewer than 3 places I knew of: on his key ring, in Renata's bag, and, as I discovered when I looked, hanging on a small hook inside their daughter Celia's backpack pocket, as if it were simply a standard item one kept about one's person. The morning I planned to go through the kitchen, I went to the market first and purchased a small, compact refrigerator, the kind colleges sell to students for dorm rooms. I carried it in myself and set it up in my bedroom. I transferred into it the things I cared about: the good cheeses I bought for myself, the jar of olives, the specific variety of yogurt I had every morning, the cold brew I made on Sundays. What remained in the main kitchen refrigerator was accurate and complete, but basic: staples, condiments, things no one could reasonably object to finding in someone else's kitchen. I was not being cruel. I was establishing a perimeter. There is a significant difference between withholding food from someone who needs it and simply declining to make your personal pantry available to people who have never asked permission to use it. The kitchen cabinets were next. The items I kept for my own daily use: the good olive oil, the sea salt in the ceramic dish, the specific tea I drank every afternoon. I moved to a cabinet I secured with a small sliding bolt latch. Nothing dramatic. The kind of latch you might put on a cabinet where you keep cleaning products away from children. The rest of the kitchen remained fully functional. A person staying in my home would not go hungry, would not be unable to cook, would not face any real deprivation. They simply would not have unrestricted access to everything I owned, as if they were in a hotel that had forgotten to charge for the minibar. The following morning, a locksmith came and changed the locks on both the front and back doors of the house, and on the door to my bedroom, and on the door to the room I used as a study. I had new keys cut for myself and for no one else. I did not inform Daniel or Renata in advance. I informed them afterward in a text message that said simply, "I've had the locks changed. If you need to come by, please call first." I did not explain. I did not apologize. I did not soften it. I sent it and I put my phone face down on the desk and I went out to water the garden. The response came in 11 minutes. It was from a Renata's number, which told me everything about who was actually managing this reaction. The message was long. It used words like shocked and hurtful and completely out of nowhere, and concluded with the sentence, "I thought we were family." I read it once and set the phone down again. I would respond later. What I was not going to do was respond from a reactive place, from the adrenaline of feeling accused. That had been my old reflex. I had a new one now. What I did instead was send Daniel a message, not Renata, Daniel, and ask him to call me at his convenience, as I had something I needed to discuss with him directly. He called that evening, later than I expected, which suggested to me that he and Renata had spent some time discussing strategy before he picked up the phone. His voice when he greeted me was careful in the way that voices are careful when a person is managing their tone consciously, which meant he was more aware of the situation than he wanted to appear. "Mom," he said, "what's going on?" "I changed the locks on my house," I said. "I'm letting you know." "Renata said you asked her to leave on Tuesday." "I did. She said it was over a vase." I held the phone and looked out the window at the oak tree in the side yard, and I said, "Daniel, your wife broke the last object I have from your grandmother. She laughed when she dropped it. Then she told me it was ugly. I asked her to leave." There was a pause. "Mom, I'm sure she didn't mean—" "I'm not asking you to judge her intention. I said. I'm telling you what happened. And I'm telling you that I've changed the locks because I've decided I'm going to be more deliberate about who comes into my home and under what circumstances. That's a decision I'm allowed to make. Of course you're allowed, he said, and his voice had shifted into the register I recognized as Daniel's conflict avoidance mode, agreeable on the surface, visibly uncomfortable underneath. But you have to understand how it feels to Renata. I understand exactly how it feels to Renata, I said. She feels that a resource has been restricted. I understand that feeling completely. What I need you to understand is that the resource in question has always been mine, and that the arrangement that existed before was a choice I made, and that I am now choosing to revise. He was quiet. I let the quiet sit. She wants to come and talk to you, he said finally. That's fine, I said. She can call me and we can find a time. With you present, Daniel, not alone. Why not alone? Because I find our conversations less productive when there's no witness, I said. That is a preference I'm exercising. He agreed to this reluctantly, and we ended the call with the surface civility we had always maintained and the deeper discomfort we had always carried without acknowledging. I set the phone down and sat at my desk for a moment, with my hands folded in front of me. I thought about how many times I had bent, in conversations with Daniel, to make the ending smoother than the content warranted. How many times I had softened the landing at the cost of the truth. Not this time. I want to say something here about my son because I think it matters for the full picture. Daniel is not a bad man. He is an accommodating man, accommodating specifically in the direction of least resistance, which, as the years passed, had come to mean accommodating Renata's expectations at the expense of examining them. He loved me. I believed that. He was also, in the way that many adult children are with the parent who gives generously and never complains, quietly complicit in a situation that benefited him. He had never asked Renata to call before coming over. He had never questioned when she mentioned using my kitchen, borrowing my car, staying over without checking first. He had floated above all of it in the comfortable attitude of a man who tells himself that everyone gets along and that getting along is sufficient. This house, every room of it, every inch of the garden, every item on every shelf, was the only place in my life that was entirely mine. Gerald had built it with me. I had kept it going alone. Whatever came next, I was going to live in it on my own terms, and my son was going to have to decide what side of that line he was standing on. 2 weeks after the Tuesday, the vase broke. 2 weeks during which I had received a total of 4 text messages from Renata, ranging in tone from injured to conciliatory, all of which I had read and not responded to with any urgency. I opened my bank statements. I do this the first of every month methodically, the way my father taught me, every line item, every transaction, every charge. I have a debit card linked to a small household account I had set up years ago specifically for shared family expenses. Groceries I bought for holiday meals when the whole family was present, that sort of thing. I had given Daniel the card number years ago for a specific occasion and had, with the thoughtlessness of someone who assumed goodwill, never thought to revoke it. What I saw when I opened that month's statement was a charge from an interior design firm on the 14th, a firm whose name I recognized because Renata had mentioned it approvingly at a dinner in March. The amount was $460. There was also a charge from a kitchenware shop on the 17th for just under $200, and on the 21st, a parking garage charge of $40 that felt almost insulting in its smallness alongside the others. I sat with the statement for a moment. Then I went back through the previous 2 months' statements with the same attention I had just given to this one. In the month prior, a flower delivery service, a restaurant charge on a Tuesday evening, a garden supply store. In the month before that, a clothing boutique, all charged to my card, all presumably by Renata, since Daniel used a different account for personal spending and the charges corresponded to dates when I had reason to know Daniel was traveling for work. I closed the statements. I picked up my phone and called my bank. I reported the card as lost or misplaced, which was, in a technical sense, accurate, in that I had lost track of where the information had ended up and in whose hands, and requested that it be canceled, and a new one issued to my address only. The representative was helpful and efficient. The call took less than 8 minutes. I went to my computer and changed the password on the online banking portal and enabled two-factor authentication tied exclusively to my personal phone number. Then I moved to the savings account I had held jointly with Daniel, an artifact from when he was in college, and I had added him for emergency access. I contacted the bank and initiated the process of removing him as a joint holder, converting it to an individual account in my name alone. This took longer, required a branch visit, and was accomplished on the Thursday of that same week. On the same morning, I met with Sandra Greer to discuss the will. Sandra listened to everything I told her with the measured attention of a person who has heard many versions of this story and understands its architecture completely. When I finished, she said, "Do you have specific changes in mind, or do you want to walk through the document together and identify what no longer reflects your intentions?" I said I wanted to walk through it together. We spent 2 hours doing exactly that. By the end of the morning, I had initiated a revision that altered the distribution of Gerald's and my estate in ways that were not punitive. I want to be clear about that, but that were precise. Precision is not the same as cruelty. Precision is simply honesty about what you actually want. I also mentioned during that meeting that my car, a 4-year-old sedan that I kept in good condition and that I relied on for all of my errands and appointments, had been borrowed by Renata on 2 occasions in the past year without my asking whether this was convenient for me. Sandra raised an eyebrow very slightly and said nothing. I said, "I'm going to change my parking situation." I had a garage, and I had never used it for the car. I had used it for storage. When I got home that afternoon, I spent the evening reorganizing the garage enough to pull the car inside, and I bought a combination padlock for the garage door. The old-fashioned side door, which was the access point from the yard. The main automatic door I'd always operated from inside the car, and no one else had the remote for it. What I was eliminating was the possibility of my car being a resource anyone could access without a conversation. The conversation from now on would have to happen, and in that conversation, I would decide. That Friday evening, at close to 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw my sister-in-law, Patricia, Gerald's younger sister, whom I had always maintained a cordial relationship with and whom I saw perhaps 4 times a year at family occasions. Standing beside her was her husband, Frank, who was holding a bottle of wine and wearing the expression of a man who has been told to come along and look agreeable. I opened the door. "Patricia," I said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she said. "I should have called. Can we come in?" I stepped back and let them into the living room and offered them tea, which they accepted. And while I put the kettle on, Patricia and Frank arranged themselves on the sofa in the careful way of people preparing for a conversation they have rehearsed. When I came back with the tray and sat down, Patricia looked at me with the expression she had been organizing on the walkover. "I've heard there's been some upset," she said. "Has there?" I said. "Daniel called me. He's worried about you. He thinks maybe you're going through something to do with Gerald, with the grief, and that it's affecting your decisions." I poured the tea and said nothing. "He mentioned the locks," Patricia said, "and the bank account." "He mentioned the bank account. He said Renata was quite distressed." I handed Patricia her cup. "That's understandable," I said. "She discovered that access she had been using without my knowledge has been removed. That's a disrupting experience, I imagine." Patricia looked at Frank briefly. Frank looked at the floor. Patricia looked back at me and said, "Margaret, I want to say something as family. As someone who knew Gerald and who knows how hard these years have been for you. Please," I said, "we're worried that you're isolating, that you're pulling away." And Frank and I were thinking we wanted to offer, if there's anything you need, financially, in terms of support or advice, we'd love to be involved. If you were thinking about what to do with the estate, with the house, any of that, we would want to be a part of that conversation. I held my cup in both hands and looked at Patricia for a long, unhurried moment. She was not a malicious woman. She was a woman who had, upon receiving Daniel's distressed phone call, seen an opening and decided to walk through it dressed as concern. I did not fault her for it exactly. I simply recognized it for what it was. "Patricia," I said, "I appreciate that you came. I know the drive isn't short, and I know that what I'm about to say may not be what you were hoping to hear, but I want to say it clearly enough that there's no confusion between us afterward. She nodded, holding her cup. My estate is mine, I said. Gerald's estate, which I inherited and have managed for 6 years, is mine. The house is mine. The savings are mine. I am not going through a grief episode that is impairing my judgment. I am going through a clarity episode that is improving it. I do not require financial advice, involvement, or oversight from anyone in the family. Not Daniel, not Renata, not you and Frank. If that changes, I will reach out. It will not change. Frank made a small sound that was not quite a word. Patricia put her cup down. Margaret, I'm glad you came, I said, and I said it warmly because I meant it. And I mean it when I say please call next time, because I would always rather make you tea by plan than by surprise. But on the subject you came to discuss, that conversation is finished. They left 40 minutes later, politely, with the bottle of wine they had brought, which I had not opened, tucked back under Frank's arm. At the door, Patricia touched my hand and said, I hope you know we care about you. I told her I did know that, and I believed some portion of it. What I also knew was that caring about someone and managing that person's assets are not the same interest, and that the conflation of the two was a very old trick that I was no longer going to be fooled by. I closed the door and stood in the entry hall and breathed. The following week was quiet in the way of a weather system that has moved on and left the air very still. I went to my book group. I walked my 3 miles every morning. I had dinner once with a friend from the hospital who had retired 2 years before me, and who spent the evening making me laugh about something completely unrelated to any of this. I felt in those days not exactly happy, but recalibrated, the way an instrument feels after it has been properly tuned. And then on Saturday morning, I went into the guest room. I want to be honest about the feeling I had standing in the doorway of that room. It was not anger. It was something closer to astonishment, Amar, the specific astonishment of seeing something plainly that you have been quietly not seeing for a long time. The room was, to an uninformed observer, simply a guest room in ordinary use. To me, standing there with fresh eyes, it was a secondary dwelling. Renata's cardigans hung in the closet. Not 1 or 2, but 6, on hangers, pressed. Her toiletry bag occupied the entire bathroom shelf. A small decorative pillow she had apparently purchased for the purpose was positioned on the bed. A framed photograph of Daniel and Renata and Celia, not of me, not of Gerald, was on the nightstand. There were books on the shelf I had not put there. A phone charger was coiled permanently around the lamp base. I had not done anything to cause this. I had not invited it or approved it. It had simply accumulated one visit at a time until the guest room of my house had ceased to be my guest room and had become, in Renata's internal geography, something functionally equivalent to a second bedroom she did not need to pay for. I spent that Saturday and part of Sunday dismantling that geography calmly and methodically. The cardigans I folded and placed in a bag. The toiletries I boxed. The photograph, the pillow, the charger, the books. All of it went into 2 large bags that I set in the entry hall. I stripped the bed and washed the linens. I put fresh ones on. My own choice, a pattern I'd always liked and that Renata had, I recalled, once said was dated. I moved my sewing table back in from the closet where I had stored it to make room for her things. I set up the small lamp I had always intended to put in there. I put my own books on the shelf. By Sunday evening, the room looked like what it was, a room in my house, reflecting my tastes, available for my use and for the use of guests I explicitly invited. I texted Daniel. I told him that I had cleared Renata's belongings from the guest room and that they were in bags in the entry hall, and that he was welcome to come collect them at a mutually convenient time, and that going forward, the guest room was no longer considered a standing accommodation. His reply came in 4 minutes. It was not a short message. It covered in order the following accusations: that I was being petty, that I had never given Renata a fair chance, that I was punishing Daniel for something that was not his fault, that I was using money and property as weapons, and that if this was how I intended to behave, then maybe it was better if we all took some space. He concluded by saying that Renata was devastated and that he hoped I understood what I was doing to the family. I read the message sitting in the kitchen chair where I had sat since Daniel was small and doing homework at the kitchen table while I made dinner. I knew that chair the way I knew my own hands. I put the phone down on the table and I sat there for a while, not responding, just feeling the full weight of what my son had written and deciding what it actually weighed. Then I picked the phone back up and typed, "I hear that you're angry, Daniel. When you're ready to talk like adults, I'm here. The bags will be in the entry hall." I set the phone down and did not pick it up again that night. 2 days later, Renata arrived at the house in the late morning. I knew she was coming because Daniel had texted to say she would, and I had said that was fine. I opened the door when she rang, and I showed her to the entry hall where the 2 bags were waiting, and I sat in the living room and waited while she looked through them to confirm everything was there. She did this with a particular kind of furious efficiency. Her movements quick and tight, her jaw set, her breathing audible. When she had finished, she straightened up and turned toward the living room and said from the hallway, "I want you to know that this is not how family is supposed to work." I looked at her from the sofa. "I agree with you," I said pleasantly. Something shifted in her face at that. A brief confusion because she had been expecting opposition and had gotten agreement instead. "Then why are you doing this?" "Because I've been trying to understand what this family actually is," I said, "and I've arrived at some conclusions that are different from the ones I started with. The room is my room, Renata. The food in the refrigerator is my food. The car in the garage is my car. The money in the account was my money. None of that is a punishment. It's simply accurate." "You changed your will," she said. It was quiet when she said it, which meant Daniel had told her, which meant my visit to Sandra's office had circled back through the family communication network faster than I had expected. "Yes," I said. "Over a vase." "No," I said. "Over a decade of choices. Mine and yours both. The vase was when I stopped pretending not to see them." She picked up the bags and walked to the door and opened it herself and left, without closing it behind her. I got up and closed it. I've replayed that conversation in my mind many times since, and what I notice each time is this. She was not wrong that families should work differently from how ours had been working. She was simply wrong about who had been responsible for that. The shape of our relationship had been mine to refuse earlier, and I had not refused it. And that was a failure of mine that I was prepared to own. But the accumulated weight of that shape was not a reason to keep carrying it indefinitely. Understanding how a bad pattern began is not the same as agreeing to continue it. The next several weeks moved through my house like seasons changing. Noticeable in cumulative effect, barely perceptible day to day. Daniel and I did not speak for 11 days. When he called again, his voice was different from the last time. Lower, more careful, stripped of the rehearsed quality I'd heard before. He said he needed to understand what I actually wanted, because he and Renata had been talking and the conversations were not going well, and he felt as though he was standing in the middle of something he didn't fully understand. I told him the truth, which was that I did not want anything from him that he wasn't genuinely offering. I told him that I loved him and had always loved him, that nothing about my decisions regarding the house or the finances was a statement about whether I loved him. I told him that what I wanted, the only thing I wanted, was for him to be in relationship with me as himself rather than as Renata's representative, and for us to be honest with each other in the way that two adults ought to be honest, without the cushioning of performance. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I don't think Renata and I are doing okay." I said, "I know." He said, "Was it that obvious?" I said, "Yes, for longer than you might think." We talked for an hour. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years, possibly in longer than that. At the end of it, I said, "There are some things I need you to understand about the house and the arrangements going forward." And I told him calmly and without drama that the guest room was not available on an ongoing basis, that the household account was closed and would not be reopened for family use, that the car was mine and the garage was locked, and that going forward, any visit, any BXUR, required a phone call in advance, not as a formality. As a genuine request that I would genuinely consider, he said, "That sounds reasonable." It was such a small sentence. That sounds reasonable. I had spent years arranging my life around the unspoken imperative that reasonable was what I had to be. Reasonable in my accommodation, reasonable in my sacrifice, reasonable in my silence. To hear my son use that word in this direction felt like something returning to its proper orientation. I also told him that same evening that he had 60 days to find his own arrangement for any items or documents of his that were currently stored at my house. I told him this without anger. I told him that 60 days was enough time and that I would box and label everything myself if he needed me to, but that at the end of 60 days, I was going to reclaim those spaces for my own purposes. He said he understood. I believed him. Renata called me once in that period, not long after her confrontation in the hallway, perhaps 10 days after. Her voice was different too, though different in a way that was harder to read. She said she wanted to apologize for the vase. She said it came out wrong, what she said afterward, that she had been flustered. I told her I accepted that apology. And I did. I meant it. But I also told her something that I had been thinking about how to say for some time. That accepting an apology and restoring access to my home and resources were two separate things, and that I was doing the first and not the second. Not as punishment, as reality. She was quiet. Then she said, "What would it take?" I said, "I don't think it's a negotiation, Renata. I think it's simply a different way of doing things." She said she wasn't sure she understood. I said I was sorry to hear that, and I meant that too. In the weeks that followed, something happened that I had not planned for. Not because I hadn't known it was possible, but because planning for it would have felt too deliberate. Too much like maneuvering a chess piece rather than watching the board. Renata and Daniel's marriage began, visibly, to reorganize itself around the absence of the resources they had been using without naming. The holiday dinner they could no longer assume would be at my house required them to plan something themselves, which revealed that they had different ideas about what to plan. The weekend they had assumed they would spend in my guest room, a trip they had apparently half organized without mentioning it to me, became an argument about whether to stay in a hotel and who would pay for it. The car I was no longer lending became a scheduling complication that exposed something they had not been communicating about. None of this was my doing, in the direct sense. It was the natural consequence of removing the scaffolding from a structure that had been leaning on it rather than standing on its own. I do not say any of this with satisfaction. I want to be careful here, because the story I am telling is not a story about a woman who won. It is a story about a woman who stopped losing. Those are not the same thing, and I think the distinction matters. One Sunday afternoon in late October, I was in the garden when I heard the gate. I looked up and it was Daniel alone without having called ahead, which I had specifically requested, and I took a breath and reminded myself that I had requested it, not demanded it with a consequence attached, because Daniel and I were in the middle of rebuilding something and I was going to give it the room to be imperfect. He stopped at the edge of the garden and said, "I should have called." "You should have," I said. "Can I sit with you anyway?" I looked at my son who had been 4 years old when we bought this house, who had spent hours in this garden building things in the dirt and losing toys in the mulch and eating tomatoes straight from the vine with the kind of unselfconscious pleasure that children have and most adults lose. And I said, "Yes, sit down." He sat in the second garden chair, the one that had been Gerald's that I had kept without quite intending to, and we sat in the afternoon light without speaking for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence we had shared in longer than I could trace. "I've been thinking," he said eventually. "About?" "About how I let things get to this point. About the ways I just didn't look at what was happening, because it was easier." I waited. "I'm not trying to apologize on Renata's behalf," he said. "She can do that herself or not. I'm apologizing for my part in it." "I know," I said. "Is that enough?" "It's a start," I said. "A real start, which is more than we've had in a while." He nodded. We sat in the garden until the light changed. He did not ask me to change anything I had decided. He did not mention the will. He did not make a case for restoring any previous arrangement. He just sat in his father's garden chair and was my son. And that was, I found, exactly what I had wanted, without knowing how to ask for it. The morning light in my kitchen has a particular quality in November, low and amber and patient, the way light is when it has shortened and learned to work harder in fewer hours. I was at the kitchen table with my tea and the crossword from the Saturday paper, which I do in pen, and the house was entirely, completely, unconditionally quiet. The new locks I had on both doors were good ones, solid tumblers, not the builder's grade hardware that had been there since we moved in. And the satisfaction I felt in the weight of the key when I held it was a small daily reminder of something I intended to keep feeling. I thought about my mother's vase, or rather about the pieces of it, which I had not thrown away. I had wrapped them more carefully and put them in a small wooden box in my bedroom closet between two folded sweaters. I did not yet know what to do with them. A friend had mentioned that there was a Japanese practice of repairing broken pottery with gold, filling the cracks rather than hiding them, and that the result was something considered more beautiful than the original because it showed its history. I had been thinking about that. I thought perhaps I might find someone who knew how to do it. I thought perhaps the vase, restored that way, might mean something different now than it had in its original form. Not a memory of only my mother's hands, but of the break itself and what came after. I had learned over the course of the months this story covers several things about myself that I had not known before. I had learned that my patience, which I had always thought of as a character strength, had a shadow, that it had sometimes been a refusal to feel conflict, dressed up as maturity. I had learned that I was capable of a calm I had not trusted myself to maintain, that my voice, even in the sharpest moments of confrontation, had stayed level, because I had decided that it would, because I was no longer afraid of the silence on the other side of a hard truth. I had learned that my house was not a symbol of my life, but an actual part of it. 4 walls and a roof and 31 years of daily living, and a garden that knew my footsteps, and a kitchen window that held the last gift of a woman I had loved, past reason, and missed every single day. And I had learned this, which is the thing I want to say most plainly, the thing I wish someone had said to me 20 years ago when I was first learning the bad habits that took me decades to unlearn, that being the kind of woman who gives without being asked and loves without conditions and keeps the peace without being paid for the labor of keeping it is a beautiful thing, a genuinely beautiful thing. But only if the giving comes from a full place, a chosen place, a place that has first answered its own needs. When the giving comes from a place of fear, fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being called selfish for having a self, it is not generosity, it is erosion. And the damage it does over time is not less real for being slow. I poured the last of my tea and looked at the herb pot on the windowsill, in the place the vase had occupied for 31 years, and I thought, I am 64 years old. I have time. Not unlimited time, but enough. Enough to do this right. Enough to live in my own house on my own terms and to love the people I love from a full place, a chosen place, a place that has first closed its door and rested and decided who it is before it opens again. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you have ever been the person in your family who gives and watches what you give, be treated as simply what you do, I want to hear from you in the comments. Not because misery needs company, but because I think clarity does, and sometimes it helps to know that someone else found their way to it too. I found mine later than I should have. That's all right. Late is not the same as never. What I know now on the other side of all of it is the same thing I knew the moment Renata picked up my mother's vase with 2 fingers. Some things are irreplaceable, and when someone treats them as disposable, the most honest thing you can do is let them see exactly what that decision costs. Not out of revenge, out of precision, out of the deep, hard-earned, unshakable conviction that the life you built, with your hands and your grief and your 30 years of showing up for everyone who needed you, is not a service available to anyone who walks through your door. It is yours. It is entirely, finally, irrevocably yours. And the most powerful sentence in any language, spoken calmly and without apology, is simply, "This is mine, and I decide." If you have stayed with me until the end of this story, I am grateful. Genuinely. Not because I needed a witness, though it is good to have one, but because I think the people who stay until the end of stories like this one are the people who know, from the inside, exactly what it feels like to be in the middle of one. I would love to know your thoughts. Whether you face something similar, whether you've already found your footing, or whether you are standing right now at the beginning of understanding that you are allowed to. Leave it in the comments below. Every single one gets read. And if this channel has become a place you come to feel less alone in stories like these, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with someone who might need it today. The next story is already waiting. Thank you for being here.